What's up, gamers? It's your boy, JKon. Welcome to another video. Today, I thought that I'd give every VCT team a grade based on their off-season moves coming into the new season. A stipulation that I want to make is that all of these grades were made prior to the start of Kickoff, and everything that we've seen so far this past week will not be considered for these rankings. I will do another ranking later on in the season, grading these new rosters, but for now, this is just for preseason/Kickoff moves. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're not, welcome back. Please go follow my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/JKonTV. I have started to stream a bit more consistently and have been co-streaming the America's Kickoff. Please feel free to stop by and say hello whenever I'm live, as I do want to build up my streaming presence. And of course, feel free to follow me on Twitter for updates and random memes. Now, without further delay, let's get into it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's start out with grading every VCT team and their offseason. We'll begin with the Americas as usual, with of course 100 Thieves. So 100 Thieves have made a few changes coming into the new year. They have brought in EU and Boostio in place of Derek and Stellar. They have also signed Zix as their head coach, all of which are really good signings that I'm a big fan of. I think they have really boosted their roster and solved a lot of the, not problems that they may necessarily have had last year, but they definitely brought in solutions. For example, Boostio is a very loud, energetic personality, and I think that's something that this team was missing, especially as they lacked a very loud vibes guy last year. If you look at their previous roster, it had a lot of quiet personalities, but with Boostio and EU in here, I think they can definitely boost that up. Also, they're bringing in the world champion IGL Boostio with his assistant coach, who have worked in tandem with one another, who won the world champion last year. I think it's just a really good combination, and it's a pretty solid team. Overall, I would give their offseason grade an A-. Next up, we have Cloud9. So Cloud9 have rebuilt their roster pretty much from the top, rebuilding, going with Zolcis's plan, except he is no longer there as he is with Sentinels. So they have brought in Oxy, Vanity, and Whippy, as well as Coach EMEA to lead this roster. We got to see them play in a few off-season events, and they looked pretty decent, although near the end they did kind of peter out. I'm not super concerned about this roster, as I think they have a lot of potential. We've seen Vanity and Zeppa both perform together consistently in the past. Jake is a very consistent up-and-comer that has a lot of potential. I think Whippy is a very underrated piece that many people seem to be sleeping on. And of course, Oxy is explosive as ever. So I think this roster can have a lot of potential. Overall, I would give this offseason a B. Moving on to Evil Geniuses. So EG, of course, they unfortunately have lost pretty much everybody from their previous roster as they were going through complications, and EG as an organization is pretty much kind of dead. So coming into this new VCT year, they have brought in 4 new players, with Apoth, Derek, Superman, and Nature replacing the previous championship core. They have kept Jogamo and Potter. Overall, I think this is like a pretty solid place to go and rebuild from. I think Nature is a very underrated player and has been competing in NA for quite a long time. Superman has been a top-rated controller player for an extremely long time, and I know EG wanted him last year, but he was in phase contract jail. Apoth was on the EG reserve team last year, so he has been part of their system for quite a long time. And Derek, I think, still has a lot of potential. He's still very good, and I think he just had a very down year, so I expect him to bounce back. Overall, I would give them a B-. Moving on to Furia. So Furia have made a couple roster changes, a third if you include the coach, of bringing in Havoc and Liazi in place of Mazine and DG Zin. They have swapped MW0 back to main duelist, and I'm kind of hesitant about this team overall. We've seen MW-led rosters kind of struggle in the past when he's on duelist. Although he puts up incredible numbers, his teams don't always find the greatest success, so I'm kind of iffy. One of the things I will say is that Liazi did look pretty good in the offseason, and Khalil is still a beast and he can click heads with the best of them. Havoc also has a lot of potential, and a lot of people from the tier 2 Brazilian community were hyping him up. So I'm excited to see how this roster will play, but I don't really have super high expectations for them. Overall, I would give their grade a B-. Moving on to G2 Esports. Now G2 is kind of sussy, so I'm just going to use the guard roster. That is the roster that they picked up this year, although technically you could say yes, G2 had the Shazam and Dapper roster along with Oxy, Whippy, and EMEA, but I'm just gonna go with the guard roster because that's the roster that we're going to see compete. Anyways, the only change that they have made coming into the new year is that they dropped Tex and have brought in Leaf. I think this is a really good signing. I think whenever you are able to keep a core that has played together for a very long time and have performed before in the past together, I think that's was a W in my book. They have also brought in a top duelist player in Leaf. I think people are underrating Leaf a little bit because C9 kind of struggled, but Leaf was top of the charts throughout the entire year last year. He's a very good duelist, so I guess he'll see how he clicks with this roster, but overall I give them an A. Moving on to Crew Esports. Crew have come into the new year with a couple of changes. They have brought in MTA in place of Nagzet, and unfortunately they had a vacancy with DVS's untimely passing, so they filled it with Shy. I think both of these signings are incredible, and I think Crew had a very underrated offseason, and I don't think a lot of people have really talked about their offseason because they didn't really participate in too many offseason events. They did go to the Superdome, but they were playing with Taco during them, so overall we didn't really get to see how strong this roster is, but I think these roster signings are great, and I would give Crew a solid A. Moving on to Leviathan. Lev have made a lot of changes since last year and have gone international. They have of course made the highlight signing of Aspas. They have also signed Tex to replace Shy as their Sentinel player, and of course they brought in Calm late into the offseason to replace Nauser, and they revamped their coaching staff, bringing in very talented coaches who have a lot of experience. So overall this team is a super team in my eyes, and I'm really excited to see them play. There's not much to say. There's only a few questions that I have is how will King and Mazzino transition to an international English-speaking roster, and how will King's IGL link be now that he's free from owner jail? I don't know, I guess we'll find out, but their grade in the offseason is an A+. Going on to Loud. Loud have only made one change in the player department, of course losing Aspas, who signed with Lev, and in his place they have signed QCK, and they brought in Pew in place of Fraud as their coach. Overall, I don't think you can really say too much about this Loud roster. Very similar to the Guard. If you keep 4 of the core that were very good together, it's a pretty much guaranteed good grade. I cannot doubt Sadak, and I really believe in this team going forward, so I give them a solid A. Moving on to MIBR. So MIBR have made a couple of changes coming into the new year. They dropped Heat and Mariz, who is their IGL, and they have brought in Mazine from Furia as their new IGL, and Ardizine, who is a young duelist player. Of course, they brought the highlight signing of Fraud, who was the coach of Loud and previously won a world championship with Bazooka. So this coaching upgrade is pretty good. Plus, they got to keep Bazooka, which is even better. I wasn't too high on the Mazine signing overall, and to me, really, if the big signing is the coach, I can't really grade the offseason too high, but I'm really excited to see this roster play. They of course will get a C+, just because my big question mark will be Mazine and his fragging department, as he did struggle last year on Furia. Going on to NRG. So for NRG, of course, they made the huge highlight signings, getting the world champions of Demon 1 and Ethan onto their roster. They also reunited Marved with his previous Optic core, with Crashes and Victor and Chet, of course, remaining from last year. This is the North American super team, and I am so pumped for this roster. I truly believe in Ethan as an IGL. I think he is an incredibly intelligent player and has developed a lot over time. He's also one of the few pure Counter-Strike players that came over from back in the day. He's been under a lot of very good IGLs, and I don't doubt that this roster will not help him in med rounding because they are very vocal players. I'm super excited for this roster. They get an A+. Going on to Sentinels. Now Sentinels, you could argue, made 2 changes because of course they brought in Zelsis as a 6th man and John QT as their new IGL, dropping Marved, who came in to replace Def late last year. We've seen this roster get to play in the offseason events. Of course, they won their own event, they won the AVL. I think with the 5 with Zelsis in there, that's just a roster that you have to stick together, and unfortunately we're going to be seeing Pancata ride the bench. Overall, with their offseason moves, I give them an A+, especially because John QT fills a lot of holes that they were missing. He's a great IGL. He can frag hard. Zelsis fills a lot of their holes that they were missing. They also brought in Zelsis as the vibes guy, which can really help stabilize their mental. And Zelsis flexibility, as well as Tenz's newfound flexibility in Agent Pool, working in tandem works really well. So I think the 2 new additions just fit this roster, and I'm excited to see them play. Heading over to the EMEA region, we'll start with BBL. So BBL have made 3 changes in their roster coming into the new year. They dropped Turco, Suchny, and Aslan Machado, and they brought in Paura, Riazi, and Elite. I like the pickups for the most part that the roster brought in. My only big question mark is Paura as an IGL. I like Suchny. I thought he did pretty well, but I don't think it was good enough for them as they decided to go back to the veteran who has returned to the organization. Riazi, I think, has a lot of talent and can really show out, and I think Elite is the big signing. The main sentinels in tier 2 of Turkey that were competing against one another for top spot was Yetuje and Elite, and Elite came out more often than not in ratings. So I don't know, but I think Elite is a pretty good signing, but their overall offseason grade, I'll give them a B. Going on to Fnatic, who of course kept everybody coming into the new year. Their only addition is Elmo Putty, who is the new head coach, as Mini decided to step down and return as assistant coach. I think this is the best roster outside of Loud coming into the new year that I have complete absolute faith in, and because they kept everybody, it's a solid A+. Plus I'm a big Leo fan. I love that guy. Going on to Foot Esports. Now, Foot, I'm really high on, and the reason for that is because I think their additions that they brought in were just pure upgrades. I think CNED is, of course, a world-class duelist player who has won a world champion. Bringing him in to replace Kiwi, who was a little bit inconsistent, is, of course, an upgrade. Moj, who was their longest-standing member, unfortunately got dropped, but they got to bring in the young gun of Yetuje, and he is pretty freaking cracked. Overall, I think with the 2 additions plus the change in the meta, I'm really high on this roster, and I think they can go pretty far. So I give their offseason an A+. Heading over to Gentle Mates, the Ascension team coming from the EMEA. They have made no changes coming into the new year, keeping everybody from Ascension. I think this team is really fun and interesting. I love their coach Existence. I've been following his career for a very long time back in Counter-Strike. Logan is one of my favorite players, funnily enough. He was one of the few Killjoy players back when everybody was playing Cypher in early Valorant. This team can be fun. Overall, since they didn't really make any changes, I would give them an A or an NA because they didn't do anything, but overall pretty cool. Going over to Giant X, who of course have only made 1 change coming into the new year, signing Redgar as the new IGL in replacement of Rhyme, who has decided to retire. I mean, I don't want to repeat myself, same thing as Loud and same thing as Fnatic, keeping everybody together. Although the only thing that drops their score for me is that Redgar can be questionable at best. I still think he has great calls at times, but his int moments can kind of precede that at times, and that's what some people will pay attention to. I think the overall roster is very stable, so we'll see how much influence Redgar's calling will change and shake that up, but I give them a B+. Heading over to Carmine Corps. So Carmine Corps went with a complete new roster coming to the new year, of course going with the young gun approach. If you want more information about this, please go check out my roster mania videos. I worked really hard on those. But for this Carmine Corps roster, I am very excited for it. They have brought in so much young talent with 3 duelist mains in Martin, Nere, and Tomazi, and they'll figure out roles and they'll flex around. I was told that Martin will be the main duelist and Narrate will be the flex, which I think is totally fine if you have such young firepower and you can mold them into the new role. Of course, a really big signing that they brought in was Aang as the head coach. Aang, of course, is most well known from his time in Gambit and Mech, and he's a great coach, and I really like this roster, and I'm super excited to see them play. I give their offseason a B+. Going on to Koi. Koi had a very confusing offseason. At first, they had like 9 players on the roster, and then they had 6 players on the roster, and then they had 2 players on the roster, and now they're back to a full 5. So, ending out with all of that, they ended up keeping Shadows and Starzo from last year. They brought in Camo, Shadow, and Grabinho to replace Wolfen, Trex, and Coldamenta. I'm not super high on the Grabinho signing. He didn't do super well in tier 2. He put up okay, decent numbers. I haven't really watched too much of him, so I don't really know. For me, the big signing is Camo. I really like the Camo signing. I think this kid is going to be insane. Shadow, I think, is a really good veteran to add, but the problem with adding Shadow and having Shadows and Starzo on the roster is that their roles overlap too much, even if Starzo is wanting to switch to controller and be the IGL. Overall, I give their offseason a B-. Heading over to Na'Vi, who of course have only made one change, bringing back Artis into the roster and bringing him back. I guess you can make a second change is Doombros has rebranded to Eric to match his brother Emil. I don't know if he's spelling it the same, but that'd be kind of funny if they did. Be kind of cute. Anyways, I'm really high on the Artis signing. I think Artis is really fundamental in breaking Angel's system, which is a little too loopy, whereas Artis I think can keep them kind of stable a little bit. I really want to see this team come and perform, and I'm really high on it. So overall, I give their offseason grade an A, very similar to the other cores that kept 4 together. Heading over to Team Heretics, of course, they have also gone with a complete rebuild coming into the new year. They have brought in Mini Boo, Woot, Riend, and Patitek. Patitek will be the 6th man who will be playing in place of Woot currently until Woot becomes of age. I really like this roster. It's very similar to the Carmine core roster in my eyes, where they brought in a bunch of rookies who have a lot of talent and firepower. I think this roster can be really good. Benji Fishy is also a late addition to the roster, as he only came in during LCQ last year, but overall, I think this roster can be really exciting. I'm glad that they also brought in Patitek, even though he's only going to be playing for a little bit. Having a veteran presence there to help raise these youngsters might be very valuable, and he is a career journeyman, and sometimes it's really nice to have some of those guys around. So overall, I will give them a B+. Now let's move on to Team Liquid. Now Team Liquid of course have dropped 3 players and brought in the core of Apex from last year, signing Kiko, Enzo, and Mystic to replace Safe, Soulcast, and Redguard from last year. I like these signings overall. Apex of course were the most dominant team in tier 2 of EMEA last year and just fell short to Gentlemates in the grand finals of Ascension. I think Kiko has a lot of potential and can really show out this year. I think EMEA in general has just so many good young rookies to keep an eye out for, and Kiko should definitely be on that list. Enzo is also a pretty solid IGL and has had pretty good experience in the past. The only thing I'm kind of questionable about is his agent pool, as he does pick some iffy stuff sometimes, but I guess we'll see. Mystic I'm really high on, as I think he should have been in franchising from the beginning. So overall, I like the offseason moves from Team Liquid. The only unfortunate thing I would say is that they did lose Safe, who is an absolute talent, who of course went to Team Vitality, but overall I will give Team Liquid a B+. Moving on to Team Vitality. Team Vitality, of course, have made a few changes coming into the new year. The latest one, of course, being the Trek signing, who unfortunately will not be playing during kickoff, but will join the team afterwards. This roster is really exciting in my opinion. I think the signing of Runner and Kicks is a really big deal, and I think Runner is the next one up out of all these young duelists, along with the Carmine core ones. I think Runner has a ton of potential. I think bringing in Safe as kind of an older mentor who can guide these youngsters, as that's kind of his goal, is a wonderful deal. They also signed Trex, who's one of the best EMEA players out there. I love this roster. I'm super hyped on them. Vitality always seem to put together pretty banger rosters in all their esports, but we'll see how they come together and perform. Overall, I will give them an A+, just because I'm super high on the Runner, Trex, and Safe signings, and Kicks is no slack. Let's head over to the Pacific region, and of course we'll start with Bleed Esports. Now, Bleed made a few changes coming into the new year after winning Ascension. They lost Neff and Juicy, who stepped down to go serve their Singaporean military service, similar to Jing. Although I don't believe that Juicy starts soon, because he is signed to DSG, who is Bleed's affiliate team. Anyways, they have Ye coming in, as well as Egoist. I think the Egoist signing is really big. He's a really strong Sentinel player, can play other roles. He was the hard carry of X10 from last year. I think he was the underrated signing comparatively this, because everybody wants to talk about Ye. Ye has a lot to prove coming into this new year, and if he's going to be playing a new role. And overall, I just think that the core itself is still really good. Scary is one of the best controller players in Pacific, immediately coming in. I think Crazy Guy is a great IGL. I like this team. I'm rooting for this team, and I hope that they do well. Overall, I will give them an off-season grade of a B+. Moving on to DFM. We hit our winless roster from 2023, and they have a lot of changes coming in. They have pretty much got everybody except for Anthem, and they brought in the core of Crazy Raccoon and also made a few other signings. May, their duelist, is extremely talented and brings a lot of firepower to this roster. Medusa is also a very well-known name that's been in the scene for a long time. I think this roster has a lot of question marks, and I'm kind of iffy on them. I'm definitely rooting for them to get a win, but I just have so many question marks, and I don't think that the Crazy Raccoon core that did perform in Japan challenges was that good. So I give them a D, just because I have so many question marks. Also, I just don't know enough about their players. Also, one of the problems I had last year was that Suggest said that he had a lot of problems with Anthem's IGLing, and he will continue to be the IGL coming into this year. So that one's also a big issue in my part, as he was the only piece that they kept from last year. Going to DRX. DRX, of course, made a couple shock droppings as they dropped Zest and RB and have signed Flashback and have promoted Foxy9 permanently to the starting roster. Overall, I think this is a pretty decent move for DRX coming into the new year. They weren't really happy with making top 4 consistently and really want to go for a title. And I think if you are just there and trying to go for a title, you need to make a gamble sometimes. And their gamble is bringing in the young firepower. I think Flashback has a lot of talent, but we've only seen him on Viper in the offseason. Foxy9, I think, can develop a lot as a player, but I was really questionable about him when he was playing Duelist. I hope that Buzz will continue to be the main Duelist for this roster. And overall, I would just give them a solid B+. They're going to be really good this year no matter what. Going to Gen G. Now, Gen G did something similar to DFM where they rebuilt around one player. In this case, it is Meteor. Meteor will be switching to the Sentinel role as they have brought in Texture, Munchkin, Lakia, and Charon. I think all of these signings are really, really big. Texture, of course, was really good on GE last year on both main Duelist and the Flex role after SK Rossi came into the main roster, but he'll be returned to main Duelist. I think he's a really, really great signing. Munchkin, of course, was playing on T1 last year, and now he'll be coming to this roster as the IGL. I think Munchkin is very underrated. I think he was one of the best Sentinel players last year in Pacific, and I was really surprised that he got dropped, but happy that he got signed to Gen G. Lakia, of course, is a fan favorite, and Charon is a newcomer that actually has impressed so far in his off-season events. They also signed Solo as the head coach and HSK as the assistant coach. Pretty big moves overall, and I'm expecting this roster to perform pretty well, but I think they will still be the second best Korean team in the region. Overall, I will give their off-season grade a B. Heading to Global Esports. Global Esports coming into the new year have made a lot of changes. They have signed Polvi as their new Duelist. They brought in Russ as their IGL. They also signed Bankai, Blaze King, and they re-signed Bazi. They also kept some of their coaching core from last year as they got promoted in Spin and Big Time. And overall, this roster has a lot of question marks as a lot of these players were kind of iffy. One of the things for me is I think Blaze King is a really, really big signing. I think Polvi also is extremely underrated as a Duelist and can show out. He's not a rookie. He's been around for a very long time, so he definitely has a bone to prove. Bankai, of course, is coming back off the bench from Paper Rex last year, and I'm just really excited. I love Bankai. I think this roster is overall pretty solid, but I'm questionable on some of their pieces. Will Bankai be able to perform well back in the tier 1 environment? How will Russ perform IGLing in the tier 1 environment? Those kinds of questions for me overall, but I will give them a C+. Moving on, we have Paper Rex. So Paper Rex, of course, have only made one change coming into the new year. They have brought in Monyet in place of Jing, who is stepping down a little bit for his military service. Overall, I love the Monyet signing. They kept 4 core of a top contender roster. I'm a huge Paper boy. I've been a fan of them for a long time. I will give them a solid A. Going to RRQ. RRQ made a couple changes coming into the new year. They have signed Jemkin as their new Duelist and Estrella as a secondary IGL and their initiator player. I'm really hype and big on this. I think Jemkin performed really, really well throughout all of last year and Ascension. A lot of people remember him for his 0-14 game, but he's much better than that game will ever tell you. Estrella is also underrated in my opinion and had a great year on D+. I like the moves that they made, and I'm really excited to see where this team goes. They were kind of on the up near the end of the year, so I will hope to see them continue that momentum. Overall, I will give their offseason an A. T1, of course, have continued to go on an international wave, and they have signed Xcurit, the older brother of Forsaken. They also signed a youngster in Izu. They brought in King at first, but then King benched himself as he was not comfortable in the English transition, and they have signed Rossi in his place. I think Rossi is one of the most underrated signings overall coming into the new year, and I think he should get his flowers. Izu, of course, is a young talent that I'm super excited for. He is a Duelist main that will be switching to controller, but is flexible as well. Xcurit will be playing flex for this team, and I'm really excited for them overall. Xcurit, I think, can bring in a ton of firepower. He was an Aubrey back in CS, so he definitely can hit shots. I will give T1 a solid A. Moving on to Talon Esports. So Talon have made a bunch of changes coming into the new year. They have brought in Frost and Boy as their new coaching staff. They brought in Governor and Ban, who of course were from NA. They signed Lenny, who is the 6th man from Team Secret, as their new IGL. They have also signed Surf back as a 6th member. This roster has a lot of questions in my opinion. Will the NA imports perform well? How well will Lenny be as an IGL? I think Ban had kind of a down year, and I wasn't super high on the Ban signing, but he did play out of role and did get better throughout the year, so I may be underestimating him. Overall, I will give this roster a B- for their offseason. Heading over to Team Secret, they made only one change coming into the new year where they dropped Dubstep and brought in NDG. NDG is a young player. I don't know too much about him. They kept 4 of the core and I like 3 of them. I thought that they should have probably looked to see if they can make an upgrade in place of Borkum, but overall I would give their offseason a B despite keeping 4. I thought they should have kept 3. Going over to Zeta. Zeta made a bunch of changes coming into the new year, which I'm pretty excited for. I thought that Crow and 10 were a bit lacking for top competition, and they have brought in 2 new youngsters in their place of Euron and Heroron. I think these young guns can bring a ton of firepower. They will also breathe new life into this roster. This will also give Depp an opportunity to be main duelist again, which I think he played quite well at. Carlisle is their new coach who came from Furia, who will bring a completely different dynamic and maybe a different perspective of the game that's different from Pacific. So overall, this roster has a lot of exciting things going for them, and I would give them an A-. But now we head over to China, where I'm going to talk a little bit about how these teams put together their rosters, more so than comparing them to their rosters from 2023. The reason for that is a lot of these teams have been rebuilt as they got introduced to the franchise league. We'll start with All Gamers, who put together a roster of Delby, Sword9, Spitfires, Bunt, Monk, and Coach Ego. Now, Delby is a new, young, kind of inexperienced duelist. He did play a little bit in China, but didn't really go too far in their tournaments. Sword9 was the assistant coach of EDG for this past year, but previously played for K1 Esports. And Bunt and Monk, of course, came from ASE, but they were on the bench. So overall, this roster kind of has a lot of question marks coming into it. How will they perform? How will a lot of these players perform coming back from being on the bench? And yeah, I just have a lot of questions. I would give their offseason grade a C+ because they have picked pretty solid players, but we don't know how solid. Moving on to BLG, who have made a couple of changes, mainly signing a new head coach in XPZ and a new IGL in Bear. Bear is not a controller player, but he will be switching to that role as he was previously a flex initiator player. BLG have wanted to relieve Bianc of the IGL duties so he can focus on fragging, and they didn't have the greatest off season as they did struggle, but they were playing with their academy players going in and out of the lineup. I think dropping Rin, who is their worst player by far, no hate to him, but he definitely struggled, and bringing in a new player is really good. So overall, I would give them a B+. Heading over to DRG, we have our Ascension team coming into the new league. The only roster change that they made is that they dropped Zeno, who was a Singaporean controller player, and brought in Nijao or TZH from FPX to take his place. I think this roster can be really good coming into the new year. T-Virus Luke is a very underrated duelist, and Fukashu is a superstar. I think this team can go pretty far, and it really depends on how well they will connect coming into the new year and how well they can keep their momentum going. They kind of had an iffy beginning of the year, but as they played more and more, they honestly won Ascension, so they have the firepower. I would give them a B overall coming into the new year. EDG, of course, did not make any changes. They are the kings of China. The only thing that I could say would make their offseason even better is if they were able to get some rest instead of going to so many events. But nonetheless, they will get an A+ from me, and I expect them to continue to dominate the region. We're going to FPX, who have made a couple of changes from their 2023 roster, if you include the signing of Autumn. Autumn, of course, came in place of Yuka after Champions before the Evolution series and was their main duelist throughout all of the Evolution series. He will now be transitioning to Flex as FPX has signed Life from ASE to be their main duelist. Life is very well known and has brought multiple rosters to international events and used to play for EDG, so he's pretty freaking good. I would give this offseason an A. We go to JD Gaming or Jingdong Gaming, and they have signed a completely new roster as they won the bidding war for the Rare Atom Core. The Rare Atom Core, of course, includes Stu, Viva, Ihao, and Martin, and they signed a new IGL of JKon, who used to play on Top Esports but was not their IGL. JDG had to make a difficult decision between either dropping their Korean IGL in Yeoman or the Korean superstar in Stu, and they went with the former. I think this roster signing is really good, just getting a really well-established core. Stu and Viva can carry you pretty freaking far as a tandem, and we'll just have to see how JKon integrates as a new IGL. They of course have the GOAT coach Val Analysis, what a freaking name. So I give them an A. If I want to talk about just their coach, I'll give them an A+. Love him. Moving on, we have Nova. Now, Nova made not really too many changes coming into the new year, and this is why a lot of people probably have them rated low, including myself. Their roster did not perform super well during Chinese events, and the only signing they really did was bring in Guang, and they signed a Russian player named Never, but he's on the bench for now. Don't really know. I'm gonna give them a C-, maybe even a D. I probably should give them a worse grade than what I gave for DFM, but grades are great. Moving on to TEC, or Titans Esports Club, Tech as they're most commonly known. Of course, the big signing here is RB, who should be on the starting roster. This team can be really good. They were only together for the 3rd evolution event and were able to place top 6. I think Abo is a very talented player. He's also IGLing from the duelist role, which is kind of crazy. They've shifted a few players and have signed Lock M, so they have a lot of players on this roster coming into the new year, and I like the signing of RB, so we'll see how they perform. I give them an A-. Next, we have Trace Esports. Now, Trace Esports have really only made one move in the offseason, signing CXYY as their 6th man. They kept everybody else on the roster. I really like this roster. I'm really high on them. I think they can be a dark horse in the region for sure. I think YOU is really freaking good, and Feng Feng is extremely underrated in terms of duelists. So because they didn't really make too many changes, gotta give them a solid A. Going on to Tai Lu. Now, Tai Lu has made a few changes, but really the most notable one is signing HFMI, the Alphabet Man, or Wi-Fi Password Man, whatever else you want to call him. I'm surprised no other team has picked him up because he is an absolute talent. They lost Abo because his loan ran out, and of course he went to go to Tech and build out that roster. Overall, I'm not super high on their roster. I think they have potential. They were able to make top 8 consistently, but is top 8 really that great? It really depends on your perspective. I think they could have made a couple more changes, but of course they have 7 players on their roster, so who knows who will be playing. Overall, I will give them a B. And last but not least in the region, and for this video, of course, we have Wolves Esports, the newcomers into the space. Their 2023 roster, of course, was being worn by the Evil Geniuses roster, as they were the main sponsor for their jerseys. Their 2024 roster has 8 players, not built around the core of Monarch, but has brought in a lot of talents from different teams. They brought in Spring from NIP, who is a very cracked duelist, Coldfish, who played for Top Esports, Plix, who was the IGL for Weibo Gaming and previously Sonics back in America, who is an Australian player. Alolba, I believe, is the only Monarch player that they are keeping, and they signed JKon as their Sentinel player, who of course has played for FPX and ASE. They have brought in a lot of experience. I'm hoping that this team will gel together. I'm super hyped for them, but of course, as I always say, guess we'll just have to wait and see. I give them a solid B+ in their offseason. And there you go. That's all 44 teams coming into the VCT 2024 season and all of their off-season changes and my grades for them. Please let me know down below what grades that you would give these teams and their off-season moves. Who do you think I have graded too low or too high? Is there any team that you are specifically rooting for coming into the new year? I would love to hear what you guys have to say down below. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And until next time, stay hydrated. Peace.